I want to talk to you today about these times that we're living in. I don't know if you know this, but throughout our Centers for Spiritual Living, there's a theme every week, and the theme this week is about how to practice kindness in a cruel world. And when I first read that title, I reacted because I don't believe in a cruel world. That's not the world I want to live in. But then the events of this last month, oh my gosh, I had to say, there's some truth to this. And every day it seems like there's a new onslaught of bad news going on. In fact, Reverend Michael Beckwith has said to us that he believes that the whole world has taken a nightmare pill. And you know, you just turn on the news and it's one nightmare after another. And then I got to looking at this the first time in probably my entire life that I ever watched, read, or paid attention to the news. Because I'm so horrified. And I'm so, no please, it's going to get better, it's going to get better. And you know what? I'd forgotten the original reason why I stopped paying attention to the news. Honestly, the news is feeding our lizard brain. Absolutely. You know, it's the flight or fright or freeze reaction. It's the part of us that gets energized by the worst possible news, by the nightmare. And that nightmare seems to have taken on some very familiar faces recently, and to be standing right up in front of us a lot. So I began to look at that figure that is so frightful. I began to feel the specter of some of the worst things that have happened in our recent history, like Hitler. And I realized that there is a guardian at the threshold. How many of you have a sense of what that term means? A guardian at the threshold. Well, as a student of mythology and Joseph Campbell, for many, many years, I've known that often when you're about to cross a threshold in consciousness, when you're about to do the final transformation, you've worked yourself hard to get to this new place. Like when you're dealing with a serious addiction or a serious physical illness, or you're just trying to learn a skill set to get some sort of professional life going. Or hey, how many of you have ever tried to lose weight? You know, the last 10% goes down screaming. Thank you. And it's about that age. Inside me, I would say that's the absolute truth. And so I'm looking at, we're about to cross a huge threshold. How do I know? We got a lot of resistance. There is a guardian at this threshold that looks like the specter of our worst behaviors and some of our worst beliefs and some of our biggest fears. So I went to Wikipedia, because Wikipedia is the expert, right? Yeah. We used to have libraries, now we have Google. So I went to Wikipedia because I wanted to find out what is the definition of the guardian of the threshold. So I just put that in there and listen to what they say. The guardian of the threshold is a spectral figure. It is the abstract of the debit and credit book of the individual. Well, that's like, real fancy talk for saying it's basically the sum total of your karma. Wow. Yeah. And then it goes on to say, it is the combined evil influence that is the result of the wicked thoughts and acts of the age in which one may live. I didn't write that. They did. The dweller on the threshold meets us in many shapes. So in mythology, there are many, many stories about this guardian. And when you go to ancient temples in India or in Southeast Asia, which are the two places that I've seen temples, I don't know about temples in Japan, but perhaps they have guardians of the threshold too. But often, right before you go into the main chamber, there are these fierce figures looming over you with gnarly faces and tusks and all kinds of and arms like you wouldn't believe. And in each hand, there is a fierce weapon. And so looking at that, that's a reminder that before you go into the entrance of the shrine, to the Holy of Holies, you must release and let go of that old fear, that old karmic debt, whatever you are holding against yourself and life, it's time to release it. And so I'm saying this is our opportunity to wake up and realize we're standing at the threshold of a huge shift in consciousness on the planet. And how do I know? Our guardian has arrived. I don't have the answers about this, but I know the guardian is here. And so it's time for us to dance. It's time for us to do what we can to release those old negative patterns. First off, for blame. Because I think, this is my own personal feeling, but it's backed up lots of times by other observations. Doesn't make it right, but nevertheless, it's the best I got at the moment. That when we move into guilt, we're doomed to repeat the same mistakes. That is not a healed place. Shame, however, is not the same as guilt. And sometimes shame, we know, can be toxic and lead to guilt. But sometimes we're due a little healthy shame. Like taking a look at some of the effects we have had in the world. Taking a look at some of our behaviors in relationship. If you've ever done a personal inventory through any kind of 12-step program, you know that looking at the effects of your behavior is a primary key part about stepping forward and getting clean and staying clean. And I believe that as a group, we're doing it. And that's part of dancing with the guardian at the threshold. So for each of us individually, I think for me personally, it's about taking this information and bringing it within. I was raised by a mother who was an activist. So I was raised in a civil rights demonstration. I was raised in an anti-war demonstration. I mean, as a kid, I was in those marches. And they were terrifying at times. But I've got to tell you, there was an incredible mana or power or presence that was also available when we stood up and used our voice together collectively for what we felt was the good. And then when I became an adult, I really looked at, was I going to carry my mom's torch forward? Was I going to continue in activism? In the world, in political activism. And so this was the early 1970s. And my own experience was, my heart was not transformed. That when I went out on those marches, I felt hate, rage, and fear. And I was 11 years old. So whose hate, rage, and fear was it? We're all collective beings swimming in a soup and tuning into it. So it was my choice at that time to go within, and I went into a convent. I went into a deep spiritual program to look at transforming my heart. That was the most radical activism I was capable of at that time. And it still guides me today. And so the guidance for me today is to look at those places inside me where I am projecting my worst fears onto the outer world. And it gives me an opportunity to wake up to this vast nightmare that seems to be going on. Because what do we know as metaphysicians? What do we know? Those of us in the transformational movement, we know that consciousness creates, that our thoughts create our experience. So is that nightmare world the world I want to live in? Is that the experience I want to see more of? No. And that doesn't mean going into denial or putting my fingers in my ears and going, oh, money, 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 money. And that's not to make fun of chanting or sacred mantras. Please hear me. I use them, but not to do a spiritual bypass. Not to use them, not to wake up to and feel all the feelings that are going on in the world today, so that I can be present and say, Black Lives Matter. And you know what? On this island, we need to say some other things and do some recreation as well. It has a particular meaning on this island, and we need to wake up to it. So I want to thank Dr. Libby for her talk 2 weeks ago and how important that was for me to hear that I've never heard. It's not to fall asleep to that. It's to wake up to it and say, it is time to open our hearts in love to all our brothers and sisters. This is one planet. This is one mind. This is one spirit. And we were born for this time. That's really what I want to say. Is you know what? The guardians at the threshold, and each one of you has chosen this time and this place to be a spiritual warrior, to wake up, to stand up. And if that means increasing your spiritual practice so that you can stay in the light, so that you can shine that light, so that you can be loved wherever you go, then that's it for you. And it's to take this in and take it personally. I know we often say don't take it personally. I want you to know there's a good and a bad to that. And I'm an expert at it. I think I got a PhD in taking it personally. And I've seen that the good side of that is when I take it within, take these deep spiritual truths within, and ask myself, where am I projecting out onto the world or onto anyone? Those things that I cannot tolerate in myself, that bring up so much fear and anger and ugliness. And then I'm going to get personal with you a little bit. There's a lot of hardship in life. Don't pretend there isn't. There is. And this week, I had a revelation about it. I'd fallen asleep early, because I like to get up early. We're talking like 4:30 in the morning. So I fell asleep, and all of a sudden, I startled awake. And as I startled awake, it was like Spirit was saying, you're going to get up because we got some news for you. And I went out to the living room, and I sat, and I listened, and it was one thing after another of showing me the various levels of hardship I've gone through in my life, and the various circumstances of that hardship. And you know, I have been a person who's wanted to rail against it. I've been ashamed of my hardships. How can you, as a Science of Mind minister, have any kind of issue? So there's that little voice going like that. And I saw that my hardship, the health issues I've had here, the financial issues I've had here, have been exactly what I needed to wake up to a bigger and deeper and more profound reality. And I can't say about your hardship, because that would be beyond where I can go. But I can tell you that in my life, I now want to embrace my hardship. Because I believe that it is there by divine appointment as my teacher. And that as I look into this process of living on Social Security, retiring and living on Social Security, has taught me the thing that blew me away when I was a little kid learning about arithmetic. And I found out that between each number was an infinite amount of numbers. What? You mean you can divide that forever between 1 and 2? There's infinity? Holy smoke, stop the class. Can we go on? We can't go on. This can't go on. Holy smokes, do you realize? And they're like, shut up, little kid. Let's move on to how to add 2 and 2. But I'm stuck on this one. To say the least, I never got it very well in school. But there is an infinite supply within everything. Oh my gosh. And then I got to take a look at how much I accumulate and never use. Never. How do I know? I've just got rid of all of it. Because I'm not taking that stuff anywhere again. And that, to me, is true abundance. Having enough. I don't know about you, but as an American, the concept of enough was not one I had. There's got to be more, right? And more, and more, and better and different. So now, see how I'm taking it personally, dancing with the guardian at the threshold? That it's time to look at, there's enough. There's an infinite supply. And that began to open me into some of the research I've done this week. Do you realize that this threshold we're standing on right now is a threshold of a global world culture? Not white bread culture. We're not talking about that. I'm talking about the fact that since 1992, 80% of the world in dire poverty is no longer there. 80%. And what was dire poverty? The definition of dire poverty was making less than $2 a day. 80% of the world has shifted above that today. Think of that. I began to read some articles out of the Indian newspapers, India Times, learning about what's going on in India. That in fact, people are coming out of poverty at an alarming rate. Huge shift. Next thing, World Health. World Health is now at unprecedented highs. Infant mortality rate is lower than it's ever been. Literacy. Do you know that literacy in the world since 1992, again, maybe it's correlated to the end of world poverty in that sense, has risen as well to being close to 90% of literacy in the world. That's better than in the United States, by the way. Yes. So I look at those figures. I look at this good news, this incredible good news, and I'm inviting you to collect some good news to counterbalance the nightmare, because it's out there. It's not only out there, but it's the real deal. That's the threshold we're standing on. And that's why we've got a guardian who just wants to make one country great. Because we're on the threshold of true globalization. We're on the threshold of a world that's awake and aware and has a voice. And I believe that we have struggled in consciousness, clearing and working on our own personal negativity so that we can assist in this process. Is it scary? How many of you feel some fear? I gotta tell you, I've had times where I just sat down and cried over some of the stuff that's going on. So if you've had a diagnosis that looks life-threatening, if you've had a major addiction that's just about killed you or killed a member of your family, if you've had a member of the family who died young, if you've had a severe car accident or some kind of catastrophic bankruptcy in your life, you know hardship. And I'm inviting you to join me in taking all those skills that your hardship has deeply and properly and beautifully prepared you for and turn them into your tools for transformation. Turn them into the skill set you're taking out into the world. We're each here as beacons of light. And so, right now, there's a segment of the world that is vibrating and resonating to your specific channel of consciousness. You are not alone. Of course, we've never been alone. But there is a specific group of humans and animals and plants that are vibrating to your consciousness. You are their leader. So imagine that Spirit is saying to you, get up, get up. I depend on you utterly. Everything that you need, you received at the moment before birth. Those are the lines that end the David White poem. Get up. I depend on you utterly. Everything you need, you were given the moment before birth. This is our birth moment. We've got all we need. Let's step into the light. So I'm going to invite you to close your eyes now.